hear the Old Testament lesson, and it really is one of the most unforgettable stories that there is in the Hebrew Bible. The story of David and Goliath. And who doesn't love a story where the underdog wins? Be it March Madness, when we get all excited about watching basketball throughout the whole country. Usually have some of the great universities of the country that are already looking forward to winning the national title. And be it north, south, east, or west, sometimes a little unknown college team sneaks in. And is it ever fun to watch them rise up through the ranks? And if some of them get towards the Final Four, you start reading in the papers or hearing the story. This is going to be a David and Goliath story. Or when an individual takes a shot at dealing with corporate America and wins. It's a David and Goliath story. How many of you like Aesop's fables? Oh, they are great. There's so much to be learned from them. How about the tortoise and the hare? You know, when the unexpected one comes through and wins, it's great. I grew up in a small southern Minnesota town, Faribault, Minnesota, and our school was in what was called the Big Nine Conference. We had seven small little farming towns and two big cities. They weren't real big, but for southern Minnesota, they were pretty substantial. Austin, Minnesota. Any of you know what happens in Austin, Minnesota? What? Hormel, the meat packing place. And so there were a lot of, it was a good-sized town, and in the high school years, they had really strong teams. They had a lot of money to invest in the team and a good population. But the Goliath in our Big Nine Conference was Rochester, Minnesota. What's Rochester, Minnesota famous for?
Mayo Clinic.
The Mayo Clinic. And they were the largest of the communities. And Austin and Rochester used to love to come in any sport whatsoever and play our teams in Faribault, Minnesota. And the reason they loved to come and play us was because we would always get our kicked. We were not very powerful. And our town oftentimes would raise really great individual athletes. Occasionally we had some really great wrestlers. Occasionally we had some state champions in the mile and track, but could never field a football team, a basketball team, or a baseball team that was anything but pretty much a loser. But when I was in 8th grade, a guy moved to our town and was a math teacher. His name was Alan Mold. Very soft-spoken. He'd been a college basketball player, and he decided we were going to develop a basketball team. So he began gathering 8th and 9th graders who didn't know how to play basketball very well, but were exhibiting different kind of talents that when put together would maybe by the time these kids were seniors in high school, a good team would be fielded. I was in that group of kids, and it was really fun. He found a couple of us that had been to the state tournament in track and could move really quickly up and down the court. Found a couple of farm kids, and I remember the names of one. His name was Jim Fuchs. He was in 9th grade, about 6 feet tall, but you could just tell he was going to get a little bit bigger. And he had been used to picking up bales of hay like this, and he was just unbelievably strong. Coach Alan Mold knew that if Jimmy just grew a few more inches, he could block anybody out of rebounding. And so he began working with Jim in that way. We had one kid his name was Alan Handel, and he was an unbelievable egotist. He wanted to score every basket. When he got the ball, didn't matter where he was, he had to shoot it. The thing was, he was really good. He scored a lot of points. so the coach began to train us in how to use him properly. But the coach decided that one thing we could do, even though we were a smaller team, was we could be better conditioned than all the other teams. And he said, we're going to play a style of basketball. By the time we get to the fourth quarter, the other team's going to be so tired, and we're going to have a chance to win. And so he ran us and ran us and ran us. And I absolutely loved those years of my life. And we had so much fun. He ran a program called Run and Gun, and he was a soft-spoken coach. We pressed full court the entire game. And as soon as we got the ball in our hands, it was fast break time. It was kind of new for those years. And when I was a senior in high school, guess what? We won every game that we played in the conference. Little David beat Austin, Minnesota. What a surprise. Little David beat John Marshall, Rochester, Minnesota. But you know, in basketball in the States, the really important games are when you're playing in your regional finals after the conference play. And it's to go to the state tournament. You can imagine in that little farm community what it was like when we went to the regional finals. And little Faribault, Minnesota was playing John Marshall, Rochester, Minnesota. Guess what the headlines on the sports page said? David and Goliath. Oh, it was electrifying. The game went to a second overtime, and we lost. Goliath won by 2 points. There's a picture of little Mark in the yearbook, sitting on the floor, cross-legged. I had my face in my hands and was crying on the basketball court because Goliath won. We love those kinds of stories, and where David wins. But we've all had the experiences where we've been in David and Goliath situations where it hasn't always turned out as idyllic as it does in this Hebrew story. First of all, I want to do 3 little background parts of this biblical lesson to tune you into the Hebrew story. And then I'm going to share 3 more things that you can take home from this story that I think will be a help for your spiritual and your faith journey. Background is really important in this story that we are so familiar with. Number 1, the Philistines have been a thorn in the side of the Israelites from the time that they have entered into the land of Canaan. God had told Joshua and the first people that came into the land of milk and honey that they were to get rid of everybody. It sounds like a cruel thing, but if they didn't get rid of everybody, eventually the religions that were localized in Canaan would be somewhat assimilated into the monotheistic religion of the Israelite people. God was not obeyed, and so the Philistines were a constant source of irritation. Now, early on for the Israelite people, militarily speaking, they were powerful enough that whenever there was an issue, they were able to push back the Philistines. And things would go well for a while, but the Philistines would always be a threat. You remember reading in the book of Judges the stories of Samson. The stories of Samson's exploits are all about battling the Philistines. And now when we meet the Philistines at this particular time, as they're ready to do war with the Israelites, this is no little thing. The Israelites definitely do not have the upper hand, and there is a possibility that if this battle is lost, it's all over for them. So this is a critical moment in their history. This battle is one they've got to win, and it doesn't look good for a number of reasons, and I just don't have time to go into it. Philistines had weapons of iron. The Israelites had wooden weapons or bronze weapons. They were outnumbered. It would have been a critical defeat for Israel. Secondly, and this is where you read into this story and you see what the author really wants you to get is not just this excitement of the picture outside that's so obvious, but the picture that's inside. And it deals with things of character and faith and hope and things like this. Saul is the king. And God had selected him, but Saul was not a person that embraced God or depended on God or was a person of real faith. And so Saul, as Israel's first king, is an abysmal failure. In fact, God says, I'm sorry I ever picked him. Isn't that the saddest thing you've heard? He could have been a great king. But with him being so bad, God tells Samuel, you go, and this was our Old Testament lesson last week, you go and anoint one who is in Bethlehem, one I will show you. And so Samuel, kind of secretly, because of course it didn't really get Saul upset, goes and he seeks out the one of God's choosing, and that is the young boy David. And God anoints him to be the future king of Israel. So watch how this story is developing, people. You've got an outgoing king that's a real failure. You got a king now as a young boy who has been anointed to be king, and they become principal players in this story. One who hasn't embraced the faith, and a young one who embraces every aspect about faith and trust and love of God. You have the most contrasting picture in these two primary characters in the story. So you have the Philistines that are powerful. You have Saul that is just been a failure. And then you got, if you're watching the story closely, the up-and-coming kid. That's the background for this story. Let me give you three things out of this story that I think are really great. Number one, and I don't see any of you with a pencil in hand. Don't any of you have your iPad here? How are you ever going to remember this? Steve's got his pen. Look at that. The deacon's always ready for anything. Number one, value your faith. Value the faith that you have in God. What was Saul's problem? He didn't value his faith. He did not value his relationship with God. He believed, all right, and almost everybody I ever talked to say they believe in God. But you know what ought to be the next question? Do you value faith and trust and dependence in God? And do you live in a way that leads and guides your life? We see the contrast here. Saul believed. I mean, he started with every bit of the potential that David had. But Saul just didn't take it seriously enough. He thought that now that he's the king, now that he has an army, now that he has great wealth and all this authority, and he is numero uno, the George Washington, if you will. And he doesn't need God. He doesn't need to be a person of faith. He doesn't need to guide his life. And David is exactly the opposite. Faith is everything to him. A relationship with God is everything to him. And as a little shepherd boy, he has time to live that and let that sink into his heart and to be guided as a person who, above everything else, would trust God, lay it on the line, because he knew that God would be Think of the hours while he was a shepherd boy that he would practice with that sling. And how he would chase away lions and bears. But he did two other things in that solitary time. He was a musician. He learned the harp. He learned the flute. And he was a writer. And in his singing, in his music, in his writing, it was always all about trusting, loving, serving, and being dependent on God. And you see the contrasts. And can you see why I'm encouraging you always, always value your faith. Don't take it for granted. Sing songs of praise. You are valuing your faith because you're here this morning. This is a good thing. We value our faith when we serve within the community of faith. Let me ask you a question. I'll just go off and lighten up for a moment. Have any of you just got caught up in praising God when you were singing all by yourself, maybe like when you were in the shower? And you just couldn't sing God's praises enough? That's valuing your faith. My second year in seminary, my folks lived about 120 miles away. We had finished midterm stuff, and I was driving in my Corvair. Do you remember that car? Most dangerous car on the road. Every once in a while, when it was icy, the rear end decided that it was going to lead the car. And there were a number of times where I did a 360, and I don't know, I'm still alive. But I'm leaving Luther Theological Seminary, St. Paul, Minnesota, driving down to Winona, Minnesota. You have to come through an area called Lakeville. Lake Pepin is there. It's really beautiful. It's a winter day, and an unusual day in Minnesota. The sun was out. I was glad to be done with my finals. And I started singing hymns, every hymn I could think of, because the radio in the car didn't work. And I'd already driven 60 miles, and I was singing these hymns, and I forgot that when you get to Lakeville, Minnesota, there's a highway patrol guy as you come into town. And, of course, I was going about 20 miles an hour over the speed limit, and all of a sudden I could see the flashing light, and oh boy, I'm screwed. Pull over, have my license all ready, hand it to the state trooper, and they have kind of I forget what the color is, but they're very distinctive with the hats, big round hats. And he asked for my license. I gave him my license, and I didn't have much money, and I sure didn't want to get a fine, and I wasn't going to open my mouth and make this situation worse. But he asked me where I was going, where I'd come from, and I told him this, and I told him I just got caught up in singing songs to God. And he looked at me like I was absolutely nuts. He hands the license back to me, and he says, slow down. Went back to his car. I didn't get a ticket. It's a good thing to get caught up in praising God. After I told that story in Vail, two people came up and told me the same story. They had been praising God, and they got out of tickets. I don't know if it works every time. See what I'm saying? Anything, dear friends in Christ, you can do that helps you to personally value faith and not forget how important it is and how blessed we are to be dependent on God who loves us. That is a good thing. Here's a second thing, really important. Take home with you. David has the mindset as he goes out to do battle with Goliath that it's not his battle. The battle belongs to the Lord. If you listen carefully in that lesson, this lesson wasn't about the power of arrows, the power of stones, the power of spears and swords and shields and the might of armies and chariots. It was about how God battles for his people. We all face challenges. Sometimes they're with health, sometimes they're with relationships. Whenever we face a challenge, it is very much like David going before Goliath. But as we go in to face any of the challenges that come our way, do you know that what the Bible teaches is that the battle belongs to the Lord? You are so loved, you are so cared about. If you trust and value God in your life, God fights for you. God goes before you. God is at your side. This is a kind of a neat one to think about. God's got your back. Isn't that good to know? David didn't need all this ridiculous armor that Saul wanted to put on him. If you read this out of another translation, the coat of mail that Saul wanted David to wear weighed as much as David. David was about 125 pounds. And how could he ever have fought with those kinds of weapons? But what was he fighting with? He was fighting with the knowledge that God would give him this victory. Take that home. Do some thinking about that. And then lastly, or thirdly, here's something to hang on to and take home. Remember, David was the writer of Psalms. And if you ask my opinion, his most famous psalm is Psalm 51. It's the penitential psalm. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your sight. Cast me not away from your presence, but restore me, renew me in faith, and uphold me by your Holy Spirit. David, essentially, was saying, hey, God, I know I'm not perfect. I know I've screwed up on a lot of things. But what is so important is I can come and lay my life before you. When I ask for forgiveness or renewal, it is given. Might be news to a couple of you in here that you're not perfect. For the rest of us, we've known him for a long time. But the point is that David had the mindset that he could charge Goliath when the whole rest of the army was immobilized and standing still, and it didn't matter. God would fight for him, but God would renew him in any kind of mistake he made, and he was an engaged, involved kind of person because he knew God would always forgive him and renew him. So my encouragement to all of you this morning is value your faith. Value the fact that you can depend and trust on God. Know, secondly, that God fights the battle for you, and he will give you the victory that he wants you to have. And in all of our imperfections, all we need to do is come before God and say, create in me a clean heart and renew my spirit, and God does that for us. Don't you love underdog stories? Don't you love the David and Goliath ones? They could tell you a whole lot more, but we don't have time. Heavenly Father, may the words of our mouths and meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O good and gracious God.